So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, lying where you are being held up. The mattress underneath you is pushing back against your weight, pushing up exactly as hard as you press down. Because those two forces are equal and opposite, nothing moves. You rest. You are not thinking about it. You do not have to. A wooden ship out on the open sea is held up by the very same quiet bargain. The water pushes up on the hull exactly as hard as the whole heavy weight of the ship presses down. So the ship floats and rides and does not sink. It is being held the way you are being held by something it never has to think about. So tonight, we are going to take one of those ships apart. Slowly, gently. From the very bottom, the long piece of wood that runs down the middle of it, all the way up to the top of the tallest mast, and then out along every rope. We are going to walk around a whole sailing ship in the dark and understand what each piece of it was actually for. The ship we are walking around is the kind that sailed in the golden age of piracy, roughly the years around 1700. Wooden ships with 3 masts and clouds of canvas, moving cargo and people, and now and then moving pirates across the Atlantic and through the warm islands of the Caribbean. Here is a small true thing worth knowing before we start. Most pirates did not build their ships. They stole them. They took ordinary merchant ships and cut down some of the upper works to make them lighter and faster, and added guns, and sailed off in something that had been made by someone else entirely. So the ship we are describing is really just a good working sailing ship of that age. The pirate is only the man who happened to be standing on it. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of all this, that is completely fine. That is honestly the whole idea. You do not need to keep the parts straight. You do not need to remember a single rope by name. The ship will still be here in the morning, floating in exactly the same water. And none of it needs you to stay awake for it. You can let go whenever you like. So let's start where the ship itself starts. Not at the deck, where the people are. Down at the very bottom, under everything, with one long piece of wood. That piece of wood is called the keel. The keel is the ship's spine. It is the first thing laid down in the shipyard, before there is anything you would recognize as a ship at all. Just a single long timber or several long timbers joined end to end, stretching the whole length of the vessel along the center of the bottom. On a big ship, this was a serious piece of wood, often elm below the waterline because elm did not rot so quickly when it stayed wet, and oak above because oak was hard and strong and there was a great deal of it in the forests of Europe. Everything else in the ship is built up from the keel. It is the line the whole ship is measured against. When shipwrights talked about the length of a ship, very often the number they meant was the length of the keel, and it does more than give the ship its length. The keel is also what keeps a ship from simply sliding sideways across the water when the wind pushes on the sails. A deep keel bites down into the sea and gives the water something to push against, so that the force of the wind turns into forward motion instead of just shoving the whole ship downwind like a leaf. We will come back to that idea later when we talk about how a sail actually works. For now, just hold the picture of it. One long wooden bone running the whole length of the ship, down at the very bottom, in the dark and the cold water. At the front end of the keel, the wood curves up and forward. That rising timber is called the stem. It is the leading edge of the ship, the part that meets the sea first and cuts it open, the part you picture when you imagine a ship's bow pushing through a wave. At the back end of the keel, another timber rises, straight up this time, and that one is called the stern post, the stem at the front, the stern post at the back, and the long keel joining them along the bottom. That is the whole skeleton in its simplest form. A spine with an upturned nose at one end and an upright tail at the other. And once that backbone was in place, the shipwrights began to build the ribs. So how does that single spine become a body? How do you turn one long bone into the whole rounded belly of a ship? So come a little closer and look at the shape of it before the planks go on. A ship, at this stage, looks like the skeleton of some enormous animal lying on its back. Rising up from the keel, at regular spaces all along its length, are curved wooden ribs. On a ship, these are called the frames. Each frame is a great curved shape that defines the cross-section of the hull at that point, how wide the ship is there, how round or how sharp its belly is. Near the middle of the ship, the frames are broad and full, because that is where the ship is widest and carries the most. Toward the bow and the stern, they grow narrower and finer, so the ship tapers to a point at each end and can slip through the water. A single frame was almost never one piece of wood. A curve that big and that strong could not be cut from one timber. So each frame was built up out of several shorter curved pieces, overlapping and bolted together. And those pieces had a lovely old name. They were called foothocks. The word is probably just a worn-down way of saying foothooks, the hooked timbers down near the foot of the frame. Shipwrights would search the forests for oak trees that had grown with a natural bend in them, a branch or a trunk that curved the right way. Because a curved piece cut from naturally curved wood is far stronger than a curve sawn across a straight grain. Whole trees were chosen and felled for the shape they happened to have grown into, and the shape of these frames was not guessed at on the day. It was worked out beforehand, sometimes with a scale model, sometimes by drawing the lines of the ship out at full size on the floor of a great long room called the mold loft. The shipwrights would draw the curves of the hull life-sized on the floorboards in chalk, and then make thin wooden patterns from those lines, and use the patterns to cut the real timbers. So the ship existed as a set of chalk lines on a wooden floor before a single frame of it ever stood up in the yard. Once all the frames were standing spaced out along the keel from stem to stern post, you had the true skeleton of the ship, ribs rising from a spine, open to the sky. You could walk down the middle of it and look up through the gaps between the frames at the clouds. It is a strange thing to picture, a ship you can see straight through. But every ship that ever sailed spent a while looking exactly like that before anyone closed it in. Because the next job was to close it in, to turn a skeleton into something that could hold out the sea. For that, they needed the planks. The planks are the skin of the ship, long boards of oak bent to follow the curve of the frames and fastened to them from stem to stern, layer after layer, until the open skeleton becomes a solid wall of wood. On the ships we are talking about, the planks were laid edge to edge, each one flush against the next, so the outside of the hull was smooth. That way of planking is called carvel. There was an older way, used on smaller northern boats, where each plank overlapped the one below it like the boards of a fence, and that is called clinker. But for a big ocean-going ship of the Golden Age, it was carvel. Smooth sides, plank butting neatly against plank, a continuous skin of oak. Bending those planks was its own quiet craft. A plank of dry oak will not curve. It will crack. So the shipwrights softened the wood first in a long box full of steam or over a slow fire until the fibers loosened enough to bend. Then they hauled the hot, damp plank against the frames and clamped it there and held it, sometimes for days, while it cooled and dried and learned the shape of the ship. Every plank on the hull had been persuaded, gently, out of straightness and into a curve. And they were held on, mostly, not with iron, but with wood. The shipwrights bored holes through the plank and into the frame behind it, and drove in long wooden pins called tree nails, which sailors said as trunnels. A tree nail is just a dowel of very hard, very dry oak, hammered into a slightly smaller hole so it fits with enormous force. Once it was in and it got wet, the wood swelled and locked itself in place and would not come out. wood swelling against wood. There were iron and copper bolts, too, in the places that needed them most. But a great deal of a wooden ship was quite literally held together by thousands of wooden pegs, each one swelling tight in the dark inside the hull. So now you have a smooth wooden hull, planked from keel to rail. But it is not yet watertight. Between every two planks there is a seam, a thin gap, and the sea would find every one of them. Here is the thing about a wooden ship. It was never truly waterproof, not in the way we mean the word. It was made to leak slowly and to be kept ahead of. So how do you seal a ship that is always, quietly, letting the water in? How do you make a wall of separate planks hold back a whole ocean? The trick that kept it ahead of the sea was called caulking. Caulking meant filling the seams. The material they filled them with was oakum, which is one of the more human details in the whole ship. Oakum was old rope. Worn-out lines, too frayed and rotten to trust aloft, were picked apart, strand by strand, back into loose fiber. This was slow, hard, boring work that shredded the fingers. It was very often given as a punishment to prisoners on shore and to men in trouble at sea. Picking oakum, hours of unwinding dead rope back into hair, and that hair, that loose, tarry hemp, was then rolled into long threads and driven down into the seams between the planks with a blade called a caulking iron and a heavy wooden mallet. A skilled caulker could tell by the sound of the mallet whether the seam was packed hard enough. Once the oakum was driven in tight, the seam was sealed over the top with hot pitch or tar, poured along it to keep the water out and the oakum in. Sailors called that paying the seams, and that is where a very old phrase comes from, the devil to pay. On a ship, the devil was the name for one of the longest and most awkward seams to reach. And paying it, sealing it with hot pitch, was a miserable job. The devil to pay. It has almost nothing to do with the underworld. It is just a caulker, somewhere in the bottom of a ship, dreading the worst seam on the whole vessel. So the hull is planked and caulked and paid with pitch, and now it will hold out the sea. But the sea was not the only thing trying to get in. Something else wanted the wood itself, in warm water, and the Caribbean is warm water. There lives a creature that sailors feared more than almost any storm. It is a long, pale, worm-like animal called the shipworm, and despite the name, it is really a kind of clam, with a tiny shell at one end that it uses like a drill. Its proper name is teredo. It bores into submerged wood and eats its way along the grain, hollowing out the timber from the inside, leaving the surface looking almost untouched, while the plank behind it turns to honeycomb. A hull could look perfectly sound from the outside and be quietly ruined within. Whole ships were lost to a creature you could barely see. And even where the shipworm did not reach, the sea grew things on the hull. Weed, grasses, barnacles by the thousand, cementing themselves to the wood below the waterline until the smooth, clean hull was wearing a thick, rough beard of living things. And a fouled hull is a slow hull. All that weed and shell drags at the water and steals the ship's speed. For a merchant ship that meant a longer voyage. For a pirate who lived or died by being faster than the ship he was chasing and faster than the ship chasing him, a fouled hull could be the difference between a good year and the end of everything. So what do you do about it? How do you clean the bottom of a ship in a world with no dry docks and no machines? So the hull had to be cleaned, and there was really only one way to do it in that age. It was called careening. You brought the ship into a quiet, sheltered beach, somewhere out of the way. You took everything heavy out of her, the guns, the cargo, the water, the ballast, until she floated high and light. Then you ran lines from the masts to the shore, or to trees, or to another vessel, and you hauled. Slowly, deliberately, You pulled the whole ship over onto her side in the shallows until her bottom was tipped up out of the water and exposed to the air. Then the crew went at that bottom with scrapers and fire, burning and scraping off the weed and the barnacles, hunting out the shipworm, replacing rotten planks, driving fresh oakum into any seam that had opened, and finally smearing the clean wood with a mixture of tallow and tar and sometimes sulfur to slow the next crop of growth. Then they hauled her upright again, floated her off, and did the whole thing a second time to clean the other side. Careening left a ship utterly helpless. On her side on a beach, unloaded, disarmed, she could not fight, and she could not run. It was the most vulnerable a crew ever was, which is exactly why pirates were so careful about where they did it. They looked for hidden coves and quiet islands, out of the shipping lanes, where they could take a week to clean the hull without a naval vessel stumbling across them, lying there defenseless in the sand. The pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas was loved partly for the good careening beaches around it. Much later, navies found a better answer, though it came too late for the Golden Age pirates. In the 1760s, the British Royal Navy began nailing thin sheets of copper over the bottom of the hull, below the waterline. Copper poisons the shipworm and the weed cannot get a grip on it, so a coppered hull stayed clean and fast and safe from the borer for years at a time. There was a hard problem to solve first, because the copper reacted with the iron bolts in the hull and ate them away in the salt water. An early coppered ship, the Alarm, had to have it all stripped off again. But by around the year 1779, the Navy had worked it out, with better bolts and a layer of paper underneath, and began coppering the whole fleet. Copper-bottomed, that is where we get the phrase for something completely reliable. But a pirate around 1718 had no copper. A pirate had a beach and a lot of hard scraping, and the constant knowledge that the sea was always eating his ship a little faster than he could clean it. So that is the outside of the hull, and the war it was always fighting. Now let's go inside and down into the belly of the ship. Come in through the darkness under the decks, and go all the way to the bottom, inside the hull, down where the light never reached. At the very bottom, sitting on top of the keel on the inside, was the ballast. Ballast is dead weight, carried on purpose, low down, to keep the ship steady. Think about it for a moment. A ship has tall masts and a great press of sail up high, and the wind leans on all of that and tries to tip the ship over. If the ship were light and empty and top-heavy, it would roll right onto its side in the first strong blow. So you load the bottom with weight to keep the center of gravity low, so that when the wind heels the ship over, the heavy bottom swings it back upright, like a weighted toy that will not stay knocked down. The ballast was usually stones, shingle from a beach or gravel, or sometimes bars of iron packed down along the bottom of the hold. Not cargo, just weight, kept there to buy stability. On top of and around the ballast was the hold. The hold is the deep storage space in the bottom of the ship, and on a long voyage it was packed. This is where the water went, in great wooden casks, and the food, salt beef and salt pork in barrels of brine, sacks of dried peas, ship's biscuit in bags, spare rope, spare canvas, spare timber, tar, everything the ship might need for months with no shop and no harbor. It was stowed with real care, because the way the weight sat in the hold changed the way the ship sailed, and because things shifting in a rough sea could be a disaster. A well-stowed hold was a matter of pride and of survival both. And at the very lowest point inside the hull, below even the hold, there was the bilge. The bilge is simply the bottom of the inside of the ship, the curved dead space where the two sides meet the keel, and it is where water collected, because a wooden ship always leaked, a little, everywhere. Rain came down the hatches, Spray came over the rail, the sea wept in through the seams no matter how well they were caulked, and all of it ran down, as water does, to the lowest place it could find, which was the bilge. So there was almost always some water down there, sloshing quietly back and forth in the dark with the roll of the ship. That water was foul. It sat in the bottom of the ship among the ballast stones and the rot and the rats, with no air and no light. It went bad, and it stank. Bilge water had a smell that sailors never forgot, sour and rotten and thick, rising up through the whole ship. It could not just be left there, because water is heavy, and a hull slowly filling from the bottom will eventually sit lower and founder. So what do you do with all that water once it is in? Do you simply live with it, sloshing in the dark? You could not, so it had to be pumped out. Every ship had pumps, worked by hand, long wooden tubes running down into the bilge. The crew took turns hauling on them, day after day, bringing the stinking water up from the bottom and sending it back over the side where it came from. On a sound ship, it was a chore. On a ship that had sprung a bad leak, it was the thing that kept everyone alive. Men would pump until they dropped. Above the hold, on a larger ship, came the lowest proper deck, called the orlop. The orlop sat down near the waterline or just below it, so it had no gun ports and saw no daylight, and it was used for the things that did not mind the dark: storerooms, the sailmakers' and carpenters' stores, and the cable tier, where the huge anchor cable was coiled down when it was not in use, a rope as thick as a man's leg, laid down in great heavy loops. On a warship, the orlop was also where the surgeons set up in battle, down below the waterline where the enemy's shot was least likely to reach, and it was a grim place to end up. But on our quiet ship, tonight, think of the orlop simply as the dim, lowest floor, close to the water, smelling of tar and damp rope, where the ship kept the things it needed but did not often touch. So that is the bottom of the ship, the ballast, the hold, the bilge, the orlop, the deep, dark, heavy foundation that everything else stood on. Now let's climb up one level, toward the light, to the deck where the ship showed its teeth. This is the gun deck. On a proper warship, it was a long, low, covered deck running almost the whole length of the ship, and down both sides of it stood the cannon. It was low on purpose. You did not want to stand fully upright here. The headroom was often less than the height of a man, so the crew moved along. It stooped among the guns in a kind of permanent crouch, and down each side, at regular spaces, were the gun ports, square hatches cut through the side of the hull, each one closed by a hinged wooden lid that could be dropped down and made watertight when the guns were not in use. When it was time to fight, the lids were hauled up on their ropes. The row of dark square holes opened along the side of the ship, and the muzzles of the guns ran out through them. Let's take a single cannon and understand it, because the cannon is a small machine in its own right. Working it was a slow, careful drill that a good crew could do in their sleep. The gun itself is a heavy tube of iron or bronze, closed at one end, open at the muzzle, sitting on a low wooden frame with small wooden wheels, called a carriage. A big gun and its carriage together could weigh 2 or 3 tons. That whole heavy thing had to be moved back and forth across the deck to be loaded and fired, again and again, by a crew of men hauling on ropes. A large gun might have a crew of a dozen or more, a small one, 5 or 6. So how did it actually work? How did a handful of men load and fire a tube of iron as heavy as a small cart, over and over on a rolling deck? Here is how they worked it. The gun starts run in, pulled back from the side, its muzzle inside the ship, so the crew can reach the mouth of the barrel. First, a man takes a tool called the sponge, a wooden staff with a wet lamb's wool head on the end, pushes it all the way down the barrel and twists it. This puts out any smoldering scraps left from the last shot. so that the fresh gunpowder does not go off early and take his arm with it. Then comes the powder in a cloth bag called a cartridge, pushed down the barrel, and after it a wad, a plug of old rope or cloth, and then the rammer, another staff, drives all of that hard down to the closed end of the gun. Then the shot itself, the heavy iron ball, goes in, and another wad after it so the ball cannot roll back out when the bow dips, and the rammer packs it all down tight. Now the gun is loaded, but it is still inside the ship, useless. So the crew hauls on the side ropes, the gun tackles, and runs the heavy carriage forward until the muzzle sticks out through the gun port and the front of the carriage is hard against the ship's side. That is running out the gun. And it was the hardest physical moment of the drill, a whole crew heaving 2 tons of iron uphill against the roll of the ship. Then the gun captain aims it, shifting the back of the carriage left or right with a long wooden bar called a handspike, and raising or lowering the muzzle with a wooden wedge called a quoin slid in under the breech. He pricks the powder bag through a small hole at the back, the touch hole, with a thin spike, and fills that hole with fine priming powder. Then, on the command, he fires it in the early days by touching a slow-burning match to the powder. Later, with a flintlock, a spark struck by pulling a cord. And then the gun does something violent. It leaps backward. All the force that throws the ball out of the muzzle also shoves the gun the other way. 2 or 3 tons of iron come hurtling back across the deck. If nothing stopped it, it would crush men and smash straight through the far side of the ship. So each gun was held by a thick rope called the breeching, made fast to the ship's side and looped around the back of the barrel, and that rope, only that rope, caught the full weight of the recoil and snapped the gun to a stop a few feet back, run in again, ready to be sponged and loaded and run out once more. A gun that broke loose from its breeching in a rough sea, careening around a crowded deck on its own, was one of the most feared things aboard. They called it a loose cannon. And now you know why that phrase means what it means. For most of the time, though, no one was firing anything. And the gun deck was not only for guns, it was also on many ships where the crew actually lived. At night, they slung their hammocks from the beams overhead in rows, side by side, so close that a man swaying in his hammock nearly touched his neighbors on both sides. They ate here too, at tables that hung between the guns and could be hoisted up out of the way. So this long, low, dim deck, with its rows of iron guns and its smell of powder and tar and men, was a barracks and a dining hall and a bedroom most days, and only now and then a place of thunder and smoke. Picture it quiet, rows of hammocks swaying gently together as the ship rolls, the guns silent and lashed tight, a single lantern moving. So that is the gun deck. Now let's leave the low dark spaces behind and go up through the hatches, onto the open deck under the sky. And then keep going, up into the masts. Come up into the open air, onto the weather deck, the top deck, the one open to the sky, and the wind and the weather that gave it its name. But before we look up at the masts, let's walk the length of this deck, from the very front of the ship all the way to the back, because the 2 ends of a ship were almost 2 different worlds. Go all the way forward first, to the bow, the front of the ship. Out here the deck narrows to a point and then reaches forward into a small platform built out over the water, tucked in beneath the bowsprit. That platform was called the beakhead, and hanging below it, right at the leading edge of the whole ship, was the figurehead. The figurehead was a carved wooden statue, the face the ship turned to the sea. And on the ships of this age, it was very often a lion, painted and sometimes covered in gold, snarling out over the waves. Some ships carried a carved woman instead, some a saint, some a king. It did nothing practical at all. It was pure feeling, a way of giving the ship a face and something like a soul. Sailors were quietly, deeply fond of theirs, and there was one very ordinary thing out at the beakhead too. It is the reason for a word you use without thinking. This open platform at the bow, washed constantly by the spray coming over the front of the ship, was where the crew went to relieve themselves. It was as far forward as a man could get, right at the head of the ship, so that the wind and the sea carried everything away and kept it clean, kept it well away from where the men slept and ate. So the ship's toilet came to be called simply the head. It still is on every vessel afloat to this day. And now you know that it comes from a wooden grating at the very front of an old sailing ship, out under the figurehead. Now turn and walk back along the deck toward the stern. Somewhere near the middle of the ship, stowed down on the deck between the masts, sat the ship's boats. Because a ship this size could rarely pull up to a beach or a dock, most of the places it went had neither. So it carried its own smaller boats aboard, several of them, nested one inside another or lashed down across the beams. There was a big, heavy one, the longboat, strong enough to carry water casks and to haul out a spare anchor. And there were lighter, smaller ones for ferrying a handful of men to shore. These boats did an enormous amount of quiet work. They carried men and supplies to land. They towed the whole ship along when the wind died away to nothing. And they did much of the heavy labor of careening. Without them, a ship was a prisoner of the deep water. Keep going aft, and the deck rises. Toward the stern of a big ship, the deck stepped up a level into what was called the quarterdeck. This was the domain of the officers, the raised deck near the back from which the ship was actually commanded, where the wheel stood and where the captain and the master kept their watch over everything spread out ahead of them. On a Navy ship, the quarterdeck was almost a sacred place, and a common sailor did not set foot on it without leave. On a pirate ship that line was blurrier, but the command of the vessel still lived back here, up high, looking forward. And beneath that raised deck, filling the whole back of the ship, was the finest room aboard, the great cabin. It stretched right across the full width of the ship, and its back wall was a long sweep of windows, the stern windows, looking out over the ship's wake. It was the captain's quarters, the one large, light private space on a vessel where every other soul was packed in shoulder to shoulder. It was where the captain slept and worked and spread out his charts, and on a grand ship where he dined. Those beautiful rows of windows across the stern, the ones you see in every painting of an old sailing ship, are the windows of the great cabin. The one calm room, right at the back, always watching where the ship had been. So that is the deck, walked end to end, from the lion at the bow to the windows at the stern. And now, look up, because above you rises the tallest and most complicated part of the whole ship, the masts and everything they carry. A full-rigged ship of this age had 3 masts standing in a line down the center of the deck. They each had a name, and the names are worth having. The one nearest the front, toward the bow, is the foremast. The tall one in the middle is the mainmast, and it is the largest of the 3. The one toward the back, toward the stern, is the mizzenmast, which is usually the smallest. Foremast, mainmast, mizzenmast, front to back. Then, reaching forward from the very front of the ship, almost horizontal, out over the water ahead of the bow, is a great spar called the bowsprit, which is really a 4th mast lying down and pointing forward. It does important work, and we will come to it. So how do you raise a mast taller than any tree in the forest? How do you make one pole stand 100 feet above the deck without it snapping? Now, each of these masts looks like a single pole from a distance, but it is not. It is built in sections, stacked one above the other, getting thinner as they go up. The lowest and thickest section, rising from the deck, is the lower mast. Above it, overlapping and fastened alongside, is a second section called the topmast. Above that, thinner again, a third called the top gallant mast, and on the tallest ships, a fourth above that, the royal mast. So the mainmast is really the main lower mast, then the main topmast, then the main top gallant mast, climbing up in thinning stages toward the sky. A single mast on a large ship could stand as tall as the ship was long, well over 100 feet from the deck to the top. Yet no single tree that tall and straight was needed, because it was assembled in pieces. Where two sections of mast overlap, there is a platform, and near the top of the lower mast, that platform is called the top. It is a real floor, a wooden shelf built out around the mast, and men could stand and work on it, and in a fight it might hold marksmen firing down onto the enemy deck. Higher up, at the next joint, instead of a full platform, there are just crossed timbers called the cross trees, spreading the rigging apart. So as you climb a mast, you pass through these platforms and cross trees, resting places on the long way up, each one smaller than the last, and crossing the masts, at right angles, held up against them, are the yards. A yard is a long horizontal spar, slung across the mast and able to swing, and its job is to carry a sail. The big square sails of the ship each hang from a yard. There is a yard low down for the biggest sail, another higher up for the next, another above that, matching the sections of the mast. The ends of a yard are called the yard arms, and that is where they hanged people, out at the very end of the yard, though we will not dwell on that tonight. Think of the yards simply as the arms of the mast, reaching out to hold the sails open to the wind. So there is the frame of the whole rig, 3 masts in a line, built up in thinning sections, the bowsprit reaching forward over the bow, and the yards crossing everything, waiting to carry canvas. It is a forest of timber standing on a moving deck. Now let's hang the sails on it, and see how much canvas a ship like this could actually spread. The sails are the engine of the ship. Everything we have talked about so far, the hull, the ballast, the masts, exists so that these great sheets of canvas can catch the wind and turn it into movement. There were a lot of them. A big ship might carry more than 24 separate sails. Each one had its own name, and the names follow a simple pattern once you have it. Start at the bottom of a mast. The lowest sail, the biggest one, the one hanging from the lowest yard, is called the course. On the foremast, it is the foresail. On the mainmast, it is the mainsail. The mainsail was the single largest sail on the ship, an enormous wall of canvas. Above the course comes the topsail, hanging from the next yard up. Above the topsail comes the topgallant, said by sailors as to'gallant, softened by centuries of tired mouths. On the tallest ships, above the topgallant, one more small square sail near the very top, the royal. So on each mast, the sails stack the way the mast sections do. Course at the bottom, then topsail, then topgallant, then royal, growing smaller as they climb, like a staircase of canvas going up into the sky. The mizzenmast, back toward the stern, was a little different. High up it carried square sails like the others, but down low, instead of a square course, it usually carried a different kind of sail entirely, one that ran along the length of the ship rather than across it. That sail is called the spanker, or sometimes the driver. It is a fore and aft sail, hung from a slanting spar, swinging out over the stern, and its job was less about pushing the ship forward and more about balance and steering, helping to turn the ship and hold her steady on her course. Think of it a little like the feathers on the back of an arrow, at the very tail of the ship, keeping her pointed the right way. Then there were the triangular sails, filling in the gaps between the square ones. Reaching forward toward that long bowsprit over the bow were the jibs, triangular headsails set on the ropes that ran down to the end of the bowsprit. You have seen these in every painting of a sailing ship, the triangles of canvas out at the front, leaning into the wind ahead of the bow, and between the masts, set on the ropes that ran from one mast down toward the foot of the next, were the staysails, more triangles, filling the spaces where the square sails could not reach. The jibs and the staysails together did a great deal of the quiet work of balancing the ship and helping her turn. So picture the whole thing under full sail in a good, steady wind. 3 masts, each carrying its stack of square sails, course and topsail and topgallant, one above the other. The triangular jibs leaning out over the bow. The staysails filling the gaps between the masts. The spanker swung out over the stern, every sail full and curved and straining, the whole ship leaning a little with the push of it, moving through the water with a sound like a long, steady breath. It is one of the most beautiful things people ever built, and it was built entirely to do one plain thing, to hold as much cloth as possible up into the wind without falling over. But you did not always want every sail set. In a light breeze, you spread everything you had, even extra sails called studding sails, set out beyond the ends of the yards on little booms, to catch every last bit of wind. And in a rising wind, you did the opposite. You took sail in, because too much canvas in a strong wind would drive the ship over onto her side or tear the masts clean out of her. Taking in sail was called reefing, when you tied up part of a sail to make it smaller, and furling, when you gathered a whole sail up out of the wind altogether and lashed it to its yard. So who did all of it? Who climbed up there to spread and gather those enormous sails? And how, in the dark, in a rising gale? This is the work that had to be done aloft, up in the rigging, in all weathers, by hand. The men who did it were called the topmen, and they were usually the youngest and the most agile of the crew. When the order came to take in the topsails, they went up the rigging higher and higher. Then out along the yards, standing on nothing but a single rope slung underneath the yard called the foot rope, leaning their bellies over the yard and hauling in the heavy, wet, wind-filled canvas with their bare hands and tying it down. In the dark, in a gale, on a ship rolling so hard that the top of the mast was scribing great arcs across the sky. The yard they stood on was swinging 30, 40, 50 feet through the air with every roll. Men fell. It was the most dangerous ordinary work on the ship, and it had to be done calmly and quickly whenever the weather turned. So when you look at those beautiful sails, remember that every one of them had to be set and taken in by a person climbing up there and doing it by hand. So that is the canvas. Now, how was all of it held up, and how was all of it worked from the deck? For that, we need to talk about the ropes, and there were quite literally miles of them. So what is all of it for? Why would one ship ever need so many miles of rope? The ropes on a ship, all of them together, are called the rigging. And the single most useful thing to understand about the rigging is that it comes in 2 completely different kinds, doing 2 completely different jobs. There is standing rigging and there is running rigging. Once you can tell them apart, the whole confusing web up there starts to make a kind of sense. Standing rigging is the rope that holds the masts up. It is fixed in place. It is set up once and then it stays, taking the enormous strain of the masts and sails. And it does not move from day to day. Its whole job is to be strong and to stay still. And because it never had to run through anything, it was coated thickly in tar to protect it from the salt and the weather, which is why the standing rigging on an old ship is black. Those heavy black ropes you see angling down from the mastheads to the sides of the ship are standing rigging. There are 2 main kinds of it. The ropes that run from the top of a mast down to the sides of the ship are the shrouds. They hold the mast from falling sideways, bracing it to port and to starboard, spreading out as they come down so they can resist the mast leaning either way. The ropes that run from the top of a mast forward and backward along the length of the ship are the stays. The ones running forward, down toward the bow and the bowsprit, are the forestays, and the ones running back are the backstays. Between the shrouds holding the mast side to side, The stays holding it front to back. The mast is locked in place from every direction, like a tent pole held by guy lines pulling evenly all around it. That word, stay, is why we say a ship is going to turn by staying. Why, when it all goes right, everything stays put. Now, the shrouds do a second clever job, because they run in near parallel lines from the side of the ship up to the mast. They make a kind of slanting ladder, so the sailors tied thin horizontal ropes across them, step by step, all the way up, and those cross pieces are called the ratlines. Ratlines. That is the ladder the topmen climbed to get aloft, the rope rungs tied across the shrouds. When you picture a sailor scrambling up the side rigging of a tall ship, he is climbing the ratlines, using the standing rigging as a stairway to the sky. To tighten all this standing rigging and take up the slack as the rope stretched and the ship worked, they used a simple, beautiful device called a deadeye. A deadeye is a round, flat block of hardwood with 3 holes bored through it, and they were fitted in pairs, one at the bottom of each shroud and one fixed to the side of the ship, with a lighter rope laced back and forth between the holes. Hauling on that lacing pulled the 2 deadeyes together and tightened the shroud. Rows of these deadeyes ran along the sides of the ship at the foot of the shrouds, and tuning them, getting every shroud to just the right tension, was part of the endless, quiet craft of keeping a ship in trim. That is standing rigging, the still, black, load-bearing rope that holds the whole rig up. The other kind is running rigging, and it is the exact opposite. Running rigging moves. It is the rope the crew actually pulls on, day and night, to set the sails, to trim them, to take them in. It runs through pulleys, which on a ship are called blocks, so that a few men hauling could move an enormous weight of wet canvas and heavy yard, and because it had to run freely through all those blocks, it was usually left pale and untarred, so you could tell it apart from the black standing rigging even in poor light. The running rigging also has a few main kinds, named by the job they do. The halyards are the ropes that haul the yards and the sails up to hoist them. The word is worn down from halyards, which is exactly what they do. The sheets are the ropes attached to the lower corners of a sail, pulling it down and back so the sail sets full and flat instead of flapping loose. And to let out the sheets is to ease those ropes and spill the wind. That, again, is where the ordinary phrase comes from. The braces are the ropes attached to the ends of the yards, so that by hauling on the brace on one side and easing it on the other, the crew could swing the whole yard around horizontally, and with it the sail, to catch the wind from a new direction. The braces are how you aimed the sails. Remember that word. When we talk in a moment about sailing toward the wind, the braces are what make it possible. There were many more. Ropes to gather the sail up to the yard for furling, ropes to haul the corners out, ropes for every small adjustment. A single large ship carried something on the order of 20 or 30 miles of rope in total. Hundreds of separate lines, each one leading down to the deck and made fast to a wooden pin at the rail, called a belaying pin, in its own particular place. And a working sailor had to know every one of them. He had to be able to go to the right rope in the dark, in a storm, half asleep, and lay his hand on it without looking. Years of a man's life went into simply learning the ropes, and there is another everyday phrase that came straight down off a wooden ship, learning the ropes, from a time when it meant it exactly. So here is one of the loveliest ideas in the whole ship, and it is the one people most often get wrong. How does a sail actually move a ship? Is it just the wind shoving it along from behind? The easy answer is that the wind pushes it, like a hand pushing on a bedsheet. And when the wind is directly behind the ship, blowing the way the ship wants to go, that is more or less what happens. The sails fill like great bags, the wind shoves them forward, and the ship runs before the wind. Simple. But that is the least interesting case, and it is not how a ship spent most of its life. The clever part is what happens when the wind is not behind you, but coming from the side or even a little from ahead, because then a sail does not act like a bag at all. It acts like a wing. When the wind flows across a curved sail, it has to travel a little faster over the outer curved side than over the inner side, and that difference creates a lower pressure on the outer side, and the sail is pulled toward that low pressure. The sail is not being pushed from behind. It is being sucked forward and sideways, the same way a bird's wing or an airplane's wing is lifted. A sail is a wing standing on its edge. Now that pull is partly forward, which is what you want, and partly sideways. That sideways part is not welcome at all, because it would just shove the ship off to the side. This is where the keel comes back, the long, deep bone at the bottom of the ship that we started with. The keel bites into the water and refuses to let the ship slide sideways. So the sideways part of the force is blocked by the keel. The forward part is left free to do its work, and the ship goes forward. The wind pulls at an angle. The keel cancels the sideways part, and what is left drives the ship ahead. That balance between the sail up in the air and the keel down in the water is the whole secret of sailing. And it means something surprising. It means a ship can sail not just with the wind behind it, but across the wind, and even partway toward the wind, not straight into it, but at an angle to it. That changes everything about how you get somewhere. Sailors had a name for every angle between the ship and the wind, and together they are called the points of sail. When the wind is behind you, you are running. When it comes across the side of the ship, you are reaching, and reaching was often the fastest and easiest way to sail. And when you turn to point as close toward the wind as the ship can manage, with the sails hauled in tight and the whole ship leaning and driving against it, you are sailing close-hauled. That was as near to the wind as you could go, because there is a limit. There is a wedge of directions right around where the wind is coming from, where no ship can sail at all. Turn too far toward the wind, and the sails stop working. They stop filling, they stop pulling, and they just flap and shiver uselessly, spilling all their wind, and the ship slows and stops. Sailors called that dead zone the no-go zone, and a ship caught stuck in it, pointing straight at the wind and unable to sail out, was said to be in irons, held fast, going nowhere, drifting slowly backward. So no ship could sail straight into the wind. It is simply impossible. The sails have nothing to grip, and the big square-rigged ships we are describing were especially poor at sailing anywhere near the wind. A small boat with fore and aft sails could point fairly close, maybe 45 degrees off the wind. A heavy, square-rigged ship could manage only about 6 points, close to 67 degrees off the wind, and even that was a struggle. So, what did you do then? How do you reach a place the wind itself is blowing from when you cannot point straight at it? You could not go there directly, so you went there in a zigzag. You sailed as close to the wind as you could on one side, close-hauled, making some ground toward your goal and some ground off to the side, and then you turned and sailed as close to the wind as you could on the other side, correcting the sideways drift and gaining a little more ground toward the goal. Then you turned back, zig, then zag, then zig again, a long saw-toothed path, each leg bringing you a little closer to a place you could not sail toward in a straight line. Sailors called this beating to windward, and it was slow and wet and exhausting. A ship might spend days clawing its way up a stretch of sea that the wind would have carried it down in an afternoon. Now, that turn from one zig to the next could be done in 2 different ways, and the difference mattered enormously. The quick way was to turn the bow up and through the eye of the wind, swinging the front of the ship across the wind so it came onto the other side. That is called tacking. It is fast and it loses almost no ground, but it was risky for a big square rigger, because right in the middle of the turn the ship is pointing straight into the wind in the no-go zone, with the sails flat and dead and no force driving her. If she lost her momentum there, she got caught in irons, stuck head to wind, unable to fall off either way. It could take a long and clumsy while to get her sailing again. The safer way was to turn the other direction, away from the wind, swinging the stern through the wind instead of the bow. That is called wearing ship. Wearing is a long, patient turn all the way around the long way, and it never passes through the dead zone, so the sails stay full and the ship stays under control the whole time. The cost is that it loses ground because you turn away from where you are trying to go and give up some of the distance you fought for. But in a heavy sea, or with a tired crew, or on a big lumbering ship, wearing was often the sensible choice. Better to lose a little ground than to get caught in irons in a gale. So, a well-sailed ship was always making that quiet judgment, tack or wear, speed against safety, over and over, all the way up the wind. So that is how a ship went where it wanted, even against the wind. But something had to point it. Something had to hold the ship on her course while the sails did their work. For that, we go all the way to the back of the ship and down to the steering. At the very back of the ship, hung on the stern post below the water, is a broad, flat blade of wood. That is the rudder. It hangs on a set of hinges, pins on the rudder dropping into rings on the stern post, called pintles and gudgeons, so that the whole blade can swing left and right in the water while staying firmly attached to the ship. And the way it steers is simple and quiet. When the rudder is straight, the water flows past it and nothing happens. But swing the rudder a little to one side, and the water flowing past pushes against the angled blade, and that push shoves the stern of the ship the other way, and the ship turns. A small blade, turning gently in the flow of water, swinging a whole heavy ship around. That is all steering ever is. But you cannot turn the rudder from up on deck by reaching down into the sea. So fitted into the top of the rudder, coming up inside the ship, is a long, stout wooden lever called the tiller. Push the tiller to one side, and the rudder swings to the other, and the ship turns. On a small boat that is the whole story, one person with a hand on the tiller, feeling the water through it. But on a big ship the tiller was a massive beam, and the force of the sea on the rudder was far more than one man could hold, and the tiller was down on a lower deck where the helmsman could see nothing at all. So how did the helmsman reach it? How do you swing a rudder the size of a door, hidden below the water, from up on the open deck? So they needed a way to work that heavy tiller from higher up, where a man could see the sails and the sea. The first answer, used for a few hundred years, was a device called the whipstaff. The whipstaff was a tall vertical pole connected at its lower end to the end of the tiller and running up through the deck above. So a helmsman standing one deck higher could grip the top of it and push it from side to side and move the tiller below. It was better than nothing, but it was awkward. It gave very little leverage, so it could only swing the rudder a small way, just a few degrees, and it was heavy going in any kind of sea. The man working it still could not really see out. He stood below, peering up through a small hatch at a scrap of sail and sky, steering half blind by the feel of the ship and the shouted orders of the officers. Steering a big ship by whipstaff in bad weather was clumsy, tiring, imprecise work. And then, right around the time our pirates were sailing, in the early 1700s, a much better answer appeared: the ship's wheel. The wheel you picture in your mind when you think of a ship, the great spoked wheel with its handles, standing up on the open deck. It works by a rope. Around the axle of the wheel is wound a rope, the tiller rope. Its two ends run down through blocks and along to the tiller. Turn the wheel one way, and it winds in the rope on one side and lets it out on the other. The tiller is hauled across, and the rudder swings, and the ship answers. The wheel gave far more leverage than the whipstaff, so a man could hold a big rudder against a heavy sea, and it could swing the rudder much further. Best of all, it let the helmsman stand upright on deck in the open, where he could see the sails and feel the wind and watch the sea ahead. On a large ship, they often fitted 2 wheels on the same axle, so that in a storm several men could haul on it together when the sea fought the rudder. Right beside the wheel stood a wooden cabinet called the binnacle, and inside it, protected from the weather, sat the compass, lit at night by a small shielded lamp so the helmsman could see it in the dark. His whole job, hour after hour, was to watch that compass and hold the ship's head steady on the course he had been given, easing the wheel a little this way, a little that way, feeling the ship try to wander and quietly bringing her back. A good helmsman steered by touch as much as by sight, feeling the pull of the sea come up through the wheel into his hands, keeping the ship walking a straight line across a moving ocean toward a place he could not yet see, and to know which way was which, and how far he still had to go. He and the officers relied on another set of quiet tools, the tools of finding your way, which is where we go next. Out in the middle of the ocean, there are no signposts, no landmarks, no roads, just water in every direction, out to a flat circle of horizon, the same in the morning as it was the night before. And somehow, on that featureless plain, sailors had to know where they were and which way to go, well enough to leave one small port and weeks later arrive at another small port thousands of miles away that they could not see until they were nearly on top of it. How they did that, with almost no instruments we would trust today, is genuinely one of the quiet marvels of the age. So how do you know where you are out there, which way to point, and how far you have already come? It started with the compass, a magnetized needle balanced so it could swing freely, always turning to point roughly north, fixed under a card marked with all the directions. It lived in the binnacle beside the helm, and it answered the first and simplest question, which way is the ship pointing? That much had been known for a long time, but knowing your direction is not the same as knowing where you are. For that, you needed 2 more things. You needed to know how fast you were going, and you needed to know how far north or south you had come. Speed came from a beautifully simple tool, and it is the reason we still measure a ship's speed in knots today. It was called the log or the chip log. It was a flat wedge of wood, weighted along one edge so it floated upright and dragged in the water, tied to the end of a very long thin line that was wound on a reel. When they wanted to know the speed, one sailor threw the wooden chip over the stern, where it caught in the water and stayed roughly still, and the line began to run off the reel as the ship sailed away from it. Now here is the clever part. Along that line, at regular measured spaces, someone had tied knots, about every 47 or 48 feet, a knot. As the line ran out over the stern, another sailor turned a small sand glass, counted the knots that slipped through his fingers before the sand ran out, about half a minute later. The number of knots that had run out in that half minute was the ship's speed. 6 knots run out, 6 knots of speed. That is the whole of it. When you hear that a ship is making 10 knots, it comes straight from a man counting actual knots on a wet rope as they passed through his hand. 1 knot means 1 nautical mile in 1 hour. Depth was just as simple and just as old. It mattered enormously near land, where a ship could tear her bottom out on a shoal she never saw. The tool was the lead line, a heavy lump of lead on the end of a long line, and the line marked off in fathoms, a fathom being 6 feet, about the span of a grown man's outstretched arms, because that is how they measured the line out, arm span by arm span. A sailor called the leadsman stood right up at the bow and swung the lead and threw it out ahead of the ship and let it sink to the bottom. And as the ship came up over it, he read the depth from the marks on the line and called it out. So the officers always knew how much water was under them and whether it was getting shallower, which is the thing that saves a ship. And there was one more touch. The bottom of the lead was hollowed out and packed with tallow, sticky fat, so that when it struck the seabed, it brought up a little sample of whatever was down there, sand, mud, shell, gravel, fine gray ooze, and an experienced navigator, feeling that sample, could often tell not just how deep the water was, but roughly where along a coast he was, because the kind of bottom changed from place to place and was written down on the charts. He could read the floor of the sea with a lump of fat on a rope. Then came the harder question. How far north or south are you? That is your latitude, and thankfully, the sky tells you, if you know how to ask. The sun climbs to its highest point at noon, and the higher or lower that noon sun sits above the horizon, the further you are toward the equator or toward the pole. So if you could measure the exact height of the noon sun above the horizon, you could work out your latitude. The old way to measure it was to stare along a stick at the sun, which slowly blinded generations of navigators. A better tool came in around the year 1594, the backstaff, which let a navigator stand with his back to the sun and measure its height by the shadow it cast, sparing his eyes. Later, in the 1730s, came a far finer instrument that used two little mirrors to bring the image of the sun down to touch the horizon, so you could measure the angle between them with real precision. That grew into the instrument we still know, the sextant. With one of these and a set of printed tables, a navigator could fix his latitude at noon to within a mile or two. Latitude was a solved problem. Longitude was not. Longitude is how far east or west you are. For most of the age of sail, it was very nearly impossible to know for certain. Ships were lost by the hundreds because of it. The reason it was so hard is strange and beautiful. Longitude is really a question about time. Because the earth turns, the sun is overhead at different places at different moments. So if you knew exactly what time it was back at your home port, at the instant the sun was highest where you stood, the difference between those two times would tell you exactly how far around the world you had gone. The trouble was the clock. No clock of that era could keep good time on a ship. The rolling, the damp, the changes in heat and cold, all of it made the best pendulum clocks useless at sea. So sailors had a perfect way to find longitude in theory, and no way at all to find it in practice. So instead, they guessed, carefully, using a method called dead reckoning. You start from a place you know, then you keep track of everything. The compass gives your direction, the log gives your speed, the sand glass gives the time, and from your direction and your speed and how long you held them, you can work out roughly how far and which way you have moved and mark your new position on the chart. Then you do it again and again, hour after hour, day after day, laying one careful guess on top of the last. And it worked, more or less, for a while, but every small error, every misjudged current, every bit of sideways drift the log could not see added up. After a few weeks in open ocean, a ship's real position and the position penciled on her chart could be many miles apart, and the crew would not know it until land appeared where no land should be, or worse, until it did not. The problem was finally answered in the century our pirates lived at the start of. In the year 1714, the British government offered a fortune, up to £20,000, an enormous sum, to anyone who could find a reliable way to determine longitude at sea, and the man who truly cracked it was not a famous astronomer, but a self-taught carpenter and clockmaker named John Harrison, who spent most of his life building a sea clock that could keep near-perfect time through all the motion and weather of a voyage. His finest one, tested on a voyage to Jamaica around the year 1761, lost only a few seconds over months at sea, which was astonishing, and it worked. At almost the same time, astronomers worked out another method, using the moon as a kind of clock in the sky, measuring its position against the stars. Between the accurate sea clock and the moon, longitude was, at last, tamed. But all of this came decades after the golden age of piracy. A pirate around the year 1718 had no sea clock and no reliable longitude at all. He found his way by holding a known latitude, sailing north or south until his noon sun told him he was level with his destination, and then turning and running straight along that line, east or west, until the land he was aiming for rose up out of the sea ahead of him. Cruder, slower, but it brought them home often enough. So that is how the ship found its way. Now let's think about the people on it, and the plainest thing of all, how they were fed. Somewhere on a lower deck, usually well forward toward the bow, was the one place on the whole ship where an open fire was allowed to burn. That was the galley, the ship's kitchen. The reason it was the only fire on board tells you almost everything about life on a wooden ship. The whole vessel was made of dry timber, tarred rope, painted canvas, and, on a fighting ship, barrels of gunpowder. Fire was the thing sailors feared above the storm and above the enemy, because a fire at sea has nowhere to be run from. So, the cooking fire was hemmed in on a great hearth of brick, or a heavy iron stove set on brick and sand, watched constantly, put out entirely in rough weather or before a battle. When the galley fire was cold, the crew ate cold. So, what did they eat, out there for months on end? What did they drink, once the water in the casks had turned green and thick? The food itself was built to last, because there was no way to keep anything fresh for long. The foundation of it was ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, which was nothing but flour and water baked hard as a board and baked again, so dry that it could keep for months or even years. It was so hard you could break a tooth on it. It was very often full of weevils, small beetles that got into the flour. So sailors learned to tap each biscuit on the table to knock the creatures out first, or simply ate in the dark and thought about something else. Alongside the biscuit came salt meat, beef and pork packed in barrels of brine, so heavily salted that it had to be soaked in water before it could be eaten at all. And even then, it was tough and gray, and the sailors called it salt horse. Dried peas boiled into a thick paste, oatmeal boiled into a gruel they called burgoo, a little cheese, a little butter gone rancid. That was the daily fare, month after month. And then there was the water, which was its own quiet misery. Fresh water was stored in great wooden casks down in the hold, and it did not stay fresh. Within weeks, it grew slimy and green and began to stink, and sailors held their breath to drink it. So ships also carried beer and wine, and above all spirits, which kept far better than water and lifted the spirits of a hard-worked crew. In the Navy, they eventually watered the rum down into a ration called grog, but a pirate ship needed no such rules, and rum was drunk freely, which is a part of the legend that happens to be true. The thing all of this food lacked was anything fresh, and that led to the sailors' oldest enemy, a disease called scurvy. We know now that it comes from going too long without the vitamin found in fresh fruit and vegetables, but they did not know that then. They only knew the pattern. After a couple of months at sea on nothing but biscuit and salt meat, men began to weaken. Their gums swelled and bled, and their teeth loosened. Old wounds and old broken bones, healed for years, quietly came undone and opened again. And then they died, slowly, of something no one could see or explain. Scurvy killed more sailors than every storm and every battle put together. The cure, it turned out, was simple: fresh citrus, lemons, and limes, and it was proven with a careful experiment in the 1740s. But it took another half-century before navies gave it out as a matter of course. For the crews of the Golden Age, scurvy was just part of the price of a long voyage, held off only by fresh fruit and greens whenever they could get ashore. Which is one more reason a quiet island with fresh water and fruit trees and a good beach to careen on was worth almost more than gold. So who was awake in the middle of the night while the rest of the ship slept? Someone always was. A ship never sleeps all at once. The wind does not stop blowing at night. The sails still need tending. Someone always has to be at the helm, and someone always has to be watching the sea. So the crew was split in two into what were called the watches, and while one half worked the ship, the other half slept, and then, a few hours later, they traded. Half awake, half asleep, around the clock, forever. On most ships, the two halves were simply named for the two sides of the ship, the port watch and the starboard watch. A sailor belonged to one or the other from the day he came aboard, and the day itself was carved into stretches of time, also called watches, each one about 4 hours long. There was the first watch in the early night, the middle watch after midnight, the loneliest one, which sailors called the graveyard watch, standing awake in the cold and the dark while most of the world slept. The morning watch before dawn, the forenoon and the afternoon. Then, in the early evening, two very short watches of only 2 hours each, called the dog watches. They were short on purpose, for a clever reason. An odd number of turns meant the schedule rotated. The men who stood the miserable graveyard watch one night would stand a kinder one the next. It was a small mercy built right into the clock. And how did they keep that clock out on the sea with no ticking timepiece to trust? They kept it with sand and with sound. A sand glass ran for half an hour, and each time it emptied, a sailor turned it over and struck the ship's bell. One stroke of the bell for the first half hour of a watch, 2 strokes after the first hour, on, adding a stroke every half hour until 8 bells rang out and the whole 4-hour watch was done and the next one began. So the whole ship told time by the bell. A sailor waking in the dark could count the strokes and know exactly where he was in the night, how long he had left to sleep before it was his turn to rise. 8 bells, the end of a watch. The words still carry a little of that weight. The people themselves each had a place and a job. There was the captain, of course, in command of everything. There was usually a master, the great expert in navigation and the handling of the ship, the one who truly knew how to sail her. There was the boatswain, said as boatswain, who was in charge of the rigging and the sails and the deck work, and who called the crew to their tasks with the shrill notes of a small silver whistle. There was the gunner, who kept the guns and the powder. The carpenter, who knew every plank and could plug a shot hole below the waterline while the sea poured in. The cook at his great kettle. And then the ordinary sailors, the hands, among them the nimble young topmen who went aloft, and the steadier men who did the heavy hauling down on the deck. Every one of them fitted into the whole, like the parts of the ship itself. And here, the pirate ship was genuinely different from the merchant ship or the navy ship. And this is one of the truer and stranger parts of the story. A navy ship was ruled from the top down, harshly, by officers a sailor had no say in. But a pirate crew, very often, ruled itself. Before they sailed, the men would draw up a set of written rules, called the Articles, laying out how any plunder would be shared, what each man's rights were, even what payment a man would receive if he lost an arm or a leg in a fight. And every man signed them or made his mark. They elected their captain by vote, and if he proved a coward or a fool or too cruel, they could vote him back out again and choose another. The captain held absolute power only in the moment of a chase or a battle, when someone had to decide instantly. The rest of the time, real day-to-day authority often lay with another elected man, the quartermaster, who spoke for the crew and settled their quarrels and divided the loot fairly. For men who had spent their lives being ordered about and flogged and cheated of their wages, that small, rough democracy on a stolen ship was a large part of the appeal. It was, in its way, a fairer world than the one they had left on shore. And there is one more thing a pirate ship carried that no honest ship did, up high, flying in the wind. Its flag. Every ship flew colors, a flag at the stern to show which country it belonged to, and at sea this mattered. because from a distance, a flag was very nearly the only way to tell a friend from a stranger. A pirate turned that whole honest system into a trick. When he spotted a fat merchant ship and gave chase, he very often did not fly his own colors at all. He flew a false flag, the flag of some friendly nation, so the merchant would let him come close, thinking him harmless, right up until it was far too late to run. Then, at the last moment, when he was near enough that escape was hopeless, he ran up his true colors, the black flag. The black flag is one of the few parts of the pirate story that is both famous and real, though it was never quite the single design we picture. Many captains flew their own. The plain white skull above two crossed bones on a black field is the one that has lasted, but there were others, whole skeletons, an hourglass to say that your time was running out, a skeleton and a man raising a glass to one another, crossed swords in place of the bones. Each captain flew his own mark, and a merchant crew who had heard the stories could sometimes tell whose ship was bearing down on them by the flag alone. The general name for that black flag has come down to us as the Jolly Roger, though where the name truly came from, no one is quite sure. There are more guesses than there are facts. Now here is the clever and strangely merciful thing about the black flag. It was not really flown to begin a battle. It was flown to prevent one. A pirate did not actually want to fight. A fight meant men killed, and worse for him. It meant damage to the very ship and cargo he was trying to take, and the risk of losing the whole prize to the bottom. What he truly wanted was for the merchant to give up without a shot. That is what the black flag was for. It said, plainly, we are pirates, you cannot outrun us, and if you surrender now, you will not be harmed. Most merchant crews, badly paid men with no reason at all to die for a cargo that was not theirs, looked at that flag and did the sensible thing. They lowered their own colors and gave up. And that, oddly, was the pirates' ideal victory, a ship taken whole and nobody hurt on either side. There was one other flag, though, and it meant the opposite. A red one, where the black flag offered mercy in exchange for surrender. The red flag, the blood-red flag, meant that no mercy would be given at all, that the crew who saw it could expect nothing whatever they did. It was the last and worst threat, meant to break a crew's will entirely before the fighting even started. So a ship being run down would watch the halyards of the pirate closing on her and pray for black and dread red. A whole conversation about life and death, held in colored cloth, across a stretch of open water, before the two ships were even in range of one another's guns. So even the flags on a pirate ship were a kind of machine, worked as carefully as the sails, and built to win the fight before it began, which was, in the end, the cleverest way to fight it all. So that is the ship and the people who worked her, from the keel all the way up. There is only one thing left to do: bring her in and let her rest. And for that, we need the last great machine on board, the one that stops her. At the very front of the ship, up in the bow, hung the anchors, the biggest and heaviest single objects the ship carried, great hooks of black iron with two curved arms called flukes. And an anchor was no good on its own. It was attached to the ship by an anchor cable, and in this age that cable was not chain, but rope, an immense rope of tarred hemp as thick as a man's thigh, so heavy that when it was soaked with seawater, it took a crowd of men just to move it. Dropping the anchor was the easy part. You came into a sheltered bay or a quiet harbor, and you let the anchor go. It fell down through the water and dug its flukes into the seabed, into the sand or the mud, and held. The ship, drifting back on the wind and tide, came up against the cable. The cable came taut, and the anchor bit deeper. The whole ship swung slowly around to face the wind and settled, held gently in one place by a hook in the ground far below. To be at anchor in a calm bay after weeks at sea was one of the great reliefs of a sailor's life. The deck stopped fighting you. The world went quiet. So how do you lift all of that by hand back up out of the sea? How do a few dozen tired men move a weight like that at all? Raising the anchor again, though, was one of the hardest jobs on the ship, because now you had to lift all that iron and all that sodden rope back up out of the sea by hand. For that, they had a machine standing up on the deck called the capstan. A capstan is a great vertical wooden drum, and around its top were holes into which the crew fitted long, stout bars, the capstan bars sticking out all around it like the spokes of a wheel laid flat. The men put their chests to those bars and pushed, and walked, round and round and round, and the drum turned, and the turning drum wound in the rope and gave the men enough force between them to drag the enormous anchor up off the bottom. It was slow, heavy, endless, shuffling work, and to keep everyone pushing in time they very often did it to music, to a fiddler perched on top of the capstan, or to a song they all sang together, a shanty, its rhythm setting the pace of the push. There was one last piece of cleverness in it. That thigh-thick anchor cable was far too big to wrap around the capstan itself, so instead they ran a second, thinner, endless loop of rope around the capstan, called the messenger, and they lashed the great cable to that moving messenger with short lengths of line called nippers. As the messenger crept around, it dragged the heavy cable along with it, and boys ran alongside tying the nippers on at the front and casting them off at the back over and over, and then coiling the freed cable down below in the hold. Those boys were called the nippers. That, gently enough, is where we get the word for a small child, from a boy no bigger than that, running back and forth along a heaving deck, tying and untying a rope on the largest job the ship ever did, and once the anchor was hauled all the way up to the bow, there was a heavy wooden beam sticking out sideways from the ship's side up there, with a pulley at its end. Its whole purpose was to swing the anchor up and out, clear of the hull, so its iron flukes would not smash against the ship's own planking. That beam was called the cathead. On many ships, the outer end of it was carved into the face of a cat or a lion, which is very likely where the name came from. Catting the anchor, they called it, hauling it up snug against the cathead and lashing it there, safe, out of the water, ready for the next quiet bay. A cat's face at the bow, holding the great iron hook that stopped the ship. So now the anchor is down, the cable is out, the ship has swung to face the wind, and come to rest in a still, dark bay. Everything we have walked through has gone quiet, so let's come back down now, all the way down, down from the top of the mast, where the top gallant is furled and lashed to its yard, down past the topsail and the course, past the black-tarred shrouds and their rope-rung ratlines, past the yards swung square and still, down onto the weather deck, past the silent wheel and the compass glowing faintly in its box, down through the hatch, onto the low gun deck where the guns are lashed tight and the hammocks sway together in rows, down again, past the hold and the water casks, past the ballast stones, all the way to the bilge and the keel, that first long bone we started with, resting now in the still black water, then out of the ship altogether, off the dark, quiet bay, out of the whole age of sail, and back into this one small room where you are lying in the dark. Come back to the bed, to the actual weight of you, resting on the mattress, held up without any effort of your own at all. Feel that for a moment, the way you did at the very beginning. You are being held. The bed pushes up exactly as hard as you press down, and so you rest, and nothing moves, and you do not have to think about it any more than the ship has to think about the sea. You are floating, in your own quiet way, held by the same simple bargain that holds up every ship that ever sailed. You do not have to keep yourself up. Something else is doing that. It always was, and you can feel, if you are still enough, the smallest rocking, your breath rising and falling, slow and even, lifting you and setting you down again, the way the swell lifts a ship at anchor and sets it gently down, over and over, patient as the tide. You are a little bit of the sea breathing. You always have been. The salt of it is in your blood, and the roll of it is in your breathing, and the room is quieter than any deck ever was, so you do not have to hold on to any of it, not the keel or the frames or the futtocks, not the oakum in the seams or the copper on the hull, not the courses and the topsails and the topgallants, not the shrouds and the stays and the halyards and the braces, not the difference between tacking and wearing, not the knots on the log line or the fathoms on the lead. You do not have to remember a single rope by name. It was never a test. It was only ever a whole quiet thing to rest your mind against while the day let go of you. If it is already fading, that is exactly right. Let it fade, because all of it will still be there in the morning. The ships are still out there, some of them, tied up in harbors as museums, their masts against the sky, their ropes still coiled on their pins. The wrecks are still down in the dark on the sea floor, their guns and their anchors going quietly green. And the sea itself is still doing what it has always done, holding up everything that floats on it, asking nothing, needing nothing from you at all. None of it needs a lookout tonight. None of it needs you to stay awake. So just rest. Let the ship lie at anchor in her dark bay. Let the watch below go on sleeping in their swaying hammocks. Let the sea hold the ship, and let the bed hold you. And let go of the last of the day the way a ship lets go of the land. The anchor is down, the bay is calm. The bell will not ring for a long while yet. You are already home.